Hello, welcome. I'm Christopher Taylor of Sovereign Harmony, and thanks for joining me again on YouTube. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. If you're used to my videos, then you're used to me focusing mostly on the energy of what's going on and using a lot of astrology to kind of pin time periods down and whatnot. We're not going to do that today. Actually, I was inspired last night because I watched PBS. A show was on called Climate of Doubt, okay? And what this did was it triggered for me my past a little bit, because my background, my schooling and everything, was very much focused on kind of weather and climate and whatnot. So I graduated with a meteorology degree, undergrad, and then I went to grad school. I did 2 grad programs, one in atmospheric science, one in environmental science and management. And for the thesis projects in both of those, master's programs, I actually did, my focus was on climate change, with, specifically with CO2. Okay, in the first one, it was more about some weather data and how it changes relative to carbon fluxes. In other words, fluxes of carbon from plants to the atmosphere, etc. We'll talk about carbon in just a second. And the other one dealt with the carbon emissions from vehicles, from Honda Motor Company. Actually, Honda Motor Company hired or partnered with the Bren School where I was going, and I did a group thesis on studying the difference between their hybrid model versus their traditional model for the Civic in terms of CO2 emissions, etc. So I have a lot of experience in CO2 emissions, which are essentially, this is essentially the primary component that humans can influence in climate, okay? And that's what this climate of doubt was about, was this whole, the controversy of climate change, and whether you fall in the left wing or the right wing, there's a lot of information out there going both ways. And at one point it was all kind of left wing and it was kind of ignored in the right wing, and then all of a sudden it started switching where the right wing started coming back. And that's what this episode was about, was what made that change? Why did the right wing suddenly strike back? Okay, and so what I'm going to discuss, because I feel like I'm in a position on a couple of levels. One, my schooling and my education. This issue is something I know a lot about, relative to the average layperson. I know a little bit more about this and about both sides of this issue than most people would, that are kind of married to a certain political party or something, and they want to believe their party, and so there's an unconscious, almost leaning toward whatever their party thinks on this issue, okay? And so that happens with every issue, it's not, but that's just the problem with the two-party system, which I can get all into on its own, which I won't so much, but, when the two sides play us against the middle, play against the middle, and we are the middle, that's when there's a problem. And I see this issue no different than any other issue, in that, we are being played, and being played in a way that makes us mad at each other instead of mad at who is playing us, okay? And so we want to turn the tides, and I'm hoping I can clear some things up, because that show, I read the title, Climate of Doubt, and I thought that it might be, a little bit more on the right-wing end of things in trying to, debunk climate change, or some of the science of climate change a little bit. I should have known it was on PBS, though, and why Mitt Romney would want to cut funding, why the Republicans are for that. It's, in PBS it certainly has a reputation among most of the media for being more liberal, more left-winged, and leaning toward that, unless you count Fox News, of course, which is a completely different story. But, and their claim is that they're the other news for the right wing, and that's, it's a shame that we can't just have something right down the middle. That would be nice, wouldn't it? Okay, instead of having people pulling us on both ends, MSNBC, oh, the left wing is right. Fox News, oh, the right wing is right. I mean, whoa, talk about your head exploding, And that actually is something called splitting, okay? When we're splitting only into either or options, okay? It makes it hard. And that's why I'm going to try to sit here and decipher this in the simpler way as possible, without getting into data, without getting into like graphs and things, and because that's when it'll get confusing. We don't have to get that far. But just to let you know, there's a difference between the science and the policy. In other words, what we're going to do about the science, okay? And we have to first understand that science has its limits. It's wonderful. but it has its limits, okay? Science is great for assessing the past. It's a logical approach. So, and logic is all about what is and what has been. So there's really no confusion. It's just a matter of gathering enough to be able to make a good assessment. And when you do that properly, that's when science is extremely useful, okay? And that, this is how science has been used properly in the whole climate debate, okay? Is in terms of the gathering of data and everything. It's very sound science, okay? I want to, and in that episode they mentioned that 97% of scientists agree that this climate change thing is happening, okay? And that humans are a part of it. And I would agree with that as well. And then the right wing has, part of the backlash has been almost to attack the science, which is really, in my opinion, because I agree with the right wing in terms of their resistance to the policies that are being enacted relative to what the science reveals. Okay, so let me get back on this side. Legitimate concerns regarding freedoms, when we start getting into things like carbon taxes and carbon trading and whatnot. Legitimate concerns, not crazy, uneducated people like the left wing tries to portray it. This is legitimate concerns, not quite as well articulated in some cases. Okay, so what? But legitimate concerns, and I'm going to come to the defense of those legitimate concerns, okay? And why we can't just make leaps from, yes, the science was done well and the science is sound, to therefore it means we must do this, okay? This is a kind of leaping that the right wing instinctually is seeing something wrong with, okay? And there is something, in my opinion, wrong with leaping to conclusions without deciphering other options that are, in my opinion, much more obvious and that are in the best interest of both sides, okay? And we'll get to that. It's actually relatively simple, but again, it's the whole who's playing the two sides against the middle that has to move out of the way before we can kind of make up and be friends again. The two sides down here, okay? And so the problem, though, is that the right wing attacked the science of it, and the science is pretty sound. And that's what the PBS episode really focused on last night. And you can't deny it. And I'm sorry for the right wingers that have the science in the books that are published about climate and this and that. That's supposedly all fake. I mean, I've gone through a lot of that information, and I can decide. I stopped studying this stuff in 2005 when I finished my last master's degree. This is before Al Gore's movie came out in 2006, the Inconvenient Truth movie. So as of 2005, I was pretty well versed in this stuff, and I've seen everything that's come out against it, and it's all graphs and charts, and I see exactly what's going on there, the manipulations that are going on. And then when you realize that a good chunk of that is being paid for by oil companies and whatnot, well, duh, who has a vested interest in keeping that together? So it makes a lot of sense when we start looking at that. So, and I feel bad for the right wing because they look bad. The science, especially on that episode, it looked pretty bad on Climate of Doubt. The whole notion of debunking climate change seemed like they made it look kind of like how Fox News makes the left wing look, the liberals look, those progressives, those crazy progressives. Well, that's what this PBS episode made the right wing look like, and they were focusing on the science. And from the science perspective, well, there were a lot of good points in that documentary. In that 1 hour time slot on PBS, a lot of good points. That the science on the left is actually much more sound. It is, but they weren't focused. They were ignoring in that episode this concept that there are other options for policy in this sort of what to do about this, and that concerns me because there is a sense that this is what we're doing. This is what we're all doing. And when all the world leaders are meeting and they're all discussing this carbon trading, and this is, I don't like to get into super deep conspiracies and whatnot, but when you start thinking like New World Order and all that, this reeks of that kind of thing. Especially, coming from where I'm coming from in my knowledge base and understanding what the other options are, and really what's going on with the two sides being played against the middle. And I can't help but almost conclude, I'm not concluding, but almost conclude that may be that is part of the motivation, that there is some kind of motivation for global control on some level. It's a little outrageous to jump to that conclusion, that's why I'm not, but it's a concern, and that's why I said legitimate concerns on this right side for our freedoms when we start taxing carbon, start doing this. Because let's face it, traveling and moving about and being able to be up at night with the lights on and whatever else burns energy, it's not our fault that the main fuel for this is carbon based. It really isn't, and we shouldn't. Not that I'm totally advocate, for conservation, and we should use as little energy as we need. We don't need to use any more than we need. So the less the better, and the more renewables the better. Why would we use the fossil fuels that result? Not just look at it from a supply standpoint. This stuff is going to run out, so we'd better have another plan in order. And look at it from like an international relations standpoint. I mean, look at the wars and things in the fighting, and you get that out of the equation when you remove the the oil and the coal and everything else. So we can. Just on that level. And then you throw in the climate change aspect, and it's just another layer, okay, of the problem of we might as well do something else in terms of generating energy, okay? But there are even easier, better options that I want to talk about, but I want to leave that for the end when I talk about the empowerment side of this. And, when I say that it's two sides being played against the middle, against each other from the top here, that's this is a disempowerment move. We're being disempowered, and it's just interesting because it's the energy economy where this climate change thing overlaps. Okay, and so the energy economy, climate change discussion here. This is where this is the one place where we have control. And so just to sum it up, the one area of influence that humans have on climate is this kind of area of greenhouse gases, and it's a very small chunk of what actually influences climate, and that's this is where the right wing gets sucked in and they get misled because they're told these truths, which are the truth that like over 80%, and you'd have to verify the numbers and whatnot, but it's roughly 80 to more of it, 80% of all climate change on Earth, if we're looking at it as a whole, is caused by simple adjustments to the angle of the sun. In other words, long term, we're talking 20,000 to 100,000 year cycles of the sun tilting in different orientations, and the path around the sun shifting from an oval to a circle and back, and kind of breathing almost. But these subtle shifts in the Earth, one is precession, one is obliquity, and one is eccentricity, and I won't get into the details of those, but they run on scales of 20,000 to 100,000 years, and they account for more than 80% of all climate change on Earth when we look at the paleoclimate data going back thousands to millions of years. This is what the patterns show, that most of the fluctuations in climate can be accountable. When you use spectral analysis and other statistical techniques, they're accountable to these larger scale aspects. And so, unfortunately, the right wing gets sucked into that, and they think, oh, it's all natural. It's just the climate changes, and it's the sun, and it's a misleading thing. And then the science can come back and say, no, you're wrong about that. It's a CO2. It's because on a smaller time scale, this is where humans have influence. Okay, this is equivalent to let's say within one season. All right. We have, let's say it's Monday, July 4th, between Monday, July 4th and Wednesday, July 6th, okay? Monday, July 4th, it's 100 degrees out. Boiling hot out, okay? Wednesday, July 6th, it's 75 degrees out, okay? So it cooled off, all right? But as far as the sun angle is concerned, because we know the sun angle changes throughout the year, right? That's why we have seasons. Our relative sun, tilt toward the sun changes. And so that's all it takes to change the seasons, is a tilt in the sun. That's why those Milankovitch cycles, those 3 cycles I mentioned, have so much influence on the Earth's climate. And they have the major influence and the major long-term influence. But on a day-to-day basis, just like within a season on a day-to-day basis, you can go from 100 degrees to 75 degrees in 2 days, especially if you live in like the northern plains or something like that in the U.S. We can get those kinds of extremes. A cold front moves through, well, but it's still summer, and it'll warm back up, okay? And so this is the equivalent, when the right wing, I feel bad for them because they get tossed into this. But this is, this is like arguing and saying like, okay, it's Wednesday, July 6th, it must be fall now because it's 75 degrees today. It was 100 degrees on Monday, and it's cooled off. And it's making those kinds of arguments doesn't make any sense because we know it's still summer. We know it's going to warm back up, and by next Wednesday it might be 100 degrees again. Okay, so that's the thing, and that's kind of where when you hear this whole natural fluctuation thing, that's kind of along the lines of what we're looking at here. Is you can't really debunk it in that frame because we're talking about different time scales. Okay, the time scale of 1 to 200 years, like we're looking at the last couple hundred years, the Industrial Revolution. And the vast amount of CO2 that's been emitted in that time period is unprecedented. And I want to state that emphatically, that's unprecedented compared to the paleoclimate data that we have. There has been no time in history, in the paleoclimate history, that CO2 has risen this fast. Okay? Nothing to do with the amount that's in the air. Okay? There has been times in the past with more CO2 in the atmosphere, like the dinosaur era, more CO2 in the atmosphere. And it was warmer back then, okay, by the way. So there have been, and that's not the issue here, because it really isn't about warming and cooling anyway. The issue here is when we rapidly influence the climate in any way. That's why it changed from this global warming thing to climate change, okay? And I'd like to further change it to climate destabilization or stabilization, because change kind of infers that we're influencing the climate in one direction, and it's going to head off in that direction. So, for example, it's going to warm up here and cool off here, from here on, because of humans. And to me that's ludicrous, because it's really more about climate destabilization or stabilization. Okay, and so it's about where we're influencing that. Are we punching the climate system in the face in some way with this massive influx of CO2, which is a major forcing factor on small time scales? Okay, not on large time scales, but on small time scales, big changes in CO2 could be big problems, okay, in terms of the thermal mass balance of the atmosphere, which is another way to say the heat and the moisture and the thermodynamic balance in general. Okay, so it's the atmosphere wants to be in balance. It wants to be in balance. In fact, a storm itself is the process of the atmosphere coming back into balance. That's all it is. Is an imbalance forms because of differences in sun angle and sunlight, heat and cold and whatnot. And an imbalance occurs, and the balancing process is a storm until it balances out. You see? And so what we're doing, by pumping a whole bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere that wouldn't have been there, and this is, it's, you can get into the science. I'm not going to argue about it. I mean, it's pretty clear that this is unprecedented amount of CO2, and also that the vast majority of that CO2 is coming from human activity. That's all very clear in the science, and I'm not going to get into any more details on that because that part is clear. But the question marks still remain, in terms of what is that influence? What is that influence going to lead to? And it has a whole lot less to do with knowing that it's going to lead to warming, quote unquote, or anything of a conclusion on that. But it's a destabilization. When you add a punch into the climate system, one of the forcing factors, which CO2 is, greenhouse gases are, in other words, if you add a punch into one of the factors that influence climate, well, if you do that in a rapid fashion, you might have a big effect on that climate. It's going to want to come back into balance, okay? Like I said, a storm is the process of coming back into balance. So a climate system that has been jolted might want to come back into rapid balance, okay? And that isn't pretty, and that's not like a fear-mongering thing, but it isn't pretty. That's why storms are kind of nasty sometimes. The bigger the imbalance, the bigger the storm. And, we don't know if a storm is on the horizon. We might be okay, That's the thing. Nothing is determined future-wise. And, as someone who works with astrology and I deal with metaphysics and whatnot, I understand probably better than most how future works versus now, And so when it comes to computer models for predicting climate, what the future climate's going to be, this is where I get really critical about what we're going to base our policies on, okay? So, because in my opinion, the future doesn't exist. It is simply an outpouring of now. So it's a creation of now. And so the more data points we have available for now, the better we can see that future. That's true, okay? Just like a computer model is going to work better with a forecast, the better the data is that's input into it. Garbage in, garbage out. So, and that's the problem with these climate models, is the data is way too imperfect, let's just put it that way, to be creating policies based on what it's predicting in terms of timing and whatnot. And there's a lot of fear-mongering going on from the left side about we have only until 2020 to make our decisions or else we're screwed. And I don't buy into that. I intuitively don't feel that that's true. Okay? There is more stuff going on this planet right now. More stuff than just CO2. That has to be made clear. Okay? There is more stuff going on than anything that humans are influencing. Okay? When it comes to like sea level change, all of this whole thing is blamed on global warming and humans. Okay? But like sea levels can rise and fall when the sea floor changes. Okay? As a case in point, the southwest of Malaysia, northwest of Australia. Okay, right where that tsunami was in 2004, around that area. That area, the buoys around that area have been at least it appears from those buoys that the sea level is dropping in those areas. And you might say, what? Huh? What do you mean? What do you mean dropping? What does that mean? I thought sea level was rising because of all this stuff. No. And the reason why it would appear to be dropping over that area, the only reason that it would be dropping over that area or appearing to drop, because the way those buoys measure is they send like radio waves or whatever down to the ground and back. So if it's measuring a shrinking zone, which is what that would indicate, then the only explanation is that the seafloor is rising. And if that seafloor is rising in that area, then it's displacing water into other areas. Okay? This is some of the geological misconceptions that are out there. Sea level rises and falls due to geologic factors too, not just melting ice and building up ice. And by the way, even though the Arctic is melting like crazy, the Antarctic is building ice right now. So what gives, right? And again, it's about climate destabilization, not warming, so it doesn't all have to be warming, but this is the point. It's like, what is going? Is it really all from the CO2? This is still a question mark. It really is. It's a conjecture. It's like what we know. We know how much CO2 humans are contributing. We know how important CO2 is on small time scales. We know how that could destabilize the climate. We just don't know what exactly that's going to mean. We don't know exactly what that's going to do. And if there's anything else affecting the Earth right now, there's no way to tease that out. Okay? There's no way to tease that out. And if we're making climate models that aren't taking that stuff into account, well, then how can we even start predicting anything, okay? And so it's not just that. I mean, that's just one example. But also note that every planet in our solar system right now, every planet is undergoing major changes. Major. So this is a solar system-wide event that is starting to happen. So we can't really blame every single thing that's going on with our weather, okay, day-to-day weather, which is also undeniably going crazy. I mean, you just have to look at the data. You just have to look at like the rainfall amounts, like the, not just temperature. Temperatures, in my opinion, is one of the worst metrics for this concept of climate destabilization, for measuring climate destabilization. Things like precipitation in terms of how much you get at one time and the gaps between that, so like droughts and floods and whatnot. That stuff is unbelievable right now, okay? And you look at the data and it's unprecedented, it's just ridiculous. In just the last few decades, what's happening, there's an amping up of this storm process, of this process of coming into balance, because there's a sense of huge imbalance out there. But is it all from the CO2? And therefore, if it's not, but if we can't answer that question, then, and if humans only have really influence on that aspect of things, we can't really blame it all on humans, can we? No. Okay? And so this is where we start getting into this idea of policy, and where I really support the right-wing effort to stall things a little bit. Because what happened here was, like when I graduated in 2005, this was still pretty much like a topic that was like near and dear to some people's hearts and whatnot. It was the Bush administration, so obviously nothing was going to get done about this. and whatnot. Then Al Gore comes out with his movie in 2006, okay? And pretty much opened up the eyes to a lot of people about what's going on, but through a lot of manipulation, okay? And let me just give you a couple of examples of that manipulation. And so one example, there's that great scene there when he gets lifted up by that forklift or whatever it is that lifts him up, so he can show us just how drastic things have changed. And it's true, the CO2 has changed. That it is that dramatic. It really is. And in some of the temperature, global average temperatures, yeah, there's some dramatic gradual trends toward warming, which is what you would expect with more CO2 in the atmosphere. But what that means in terms of weather is a different story. Okay, but back to the manipulations. Okay, so that pattern you notice on that graph, it was like CO2 and temperature going with each other. And so we look at statistics, and we automatically want to say, well, which one's causing which? What's the chicken, what's the egg? Chicken or the egg? Chicken or the egg? And it's interesting because when I was in college, and I have a book like right here, actually, right there, and I pulled it out, I looked at it, and I read the paragraph when I was watching the documentary by Al Gore, because up until that documentary, I was pretty much left-wing sided. It was like, well, the science says so, and but there was no sense of jumping into policy at that point, which is why it was okay, because there was no sense of it being right or wrong, or it was just like the science was sound, and it was what it was. Well, what are we going to do about it? Was kind of the question mark. But anyway, so the book is over there, and I pulled it out when I was watching the documentary, because in the documentary, Al Gore states, he said, he basically says that as CO2 rises, temperature goes up with it. And he's right, because CO2 will cause temperature rise. But on those timescales, that timescale that he's using is like 600,000 years, okay? So let's get back to Milankovitch now. On that timescale, what's causing most of that are the Milankovitch cycles, first of all. Remember, those are 20,000 to 100,000 year timescales. This is 600,000 years. So there's several Milankovitch cycles of those three different things, precession, obliquity, and eccentricity, happen in that time. The majority of that pattern is from the Milankovitch cycles. Let's just start there, okay? Doesn't say anything about the Milankovitch cycles, all right? And then, and that's not what I had to look up. I already knew that. But when he says that, as CO2 rises, temperature rises, this is true on small time scales, okay? This is true because CO2 will feed back, okay? And but on the time scales of 600,000 years, it is well documented. That's what I pulled up in this book, and it's well understood by science, and this was probably more than 10 years ago. But modern science, in other words, agrees that on those time scales, 600,000 years or so, we're talking about temperature leading the way. So in other words, it warms, and then because of the warming, this releases things like methane clathorates and things like that. And there are other when it starts warming, more CO2 gets released. I'm not going to get into the feedback mechanisms here, but the idea is that happens too. They are a chicken and egg scenario, which is part of the right-wing argument too. It's like, well, no, temperature causes CO2, and they're right. On those large timescales, they're absolutely right. And Al Gore was absolutely wrong when he pointed out that that's what was going on in that. If he were to shrink it into the 200-year timescale, then he's right, okay? So this is a distinguishing. We got to distinguish. We got to discriminate here. So right wing is correct when they say that it's temperature that causes CO2. Yes, on large timescales, but even with that, CO2 is increasing the temperature. It's a feedback. It's a positive feedback. That's why it gets extreme. That's why those peaks in that graph were high and low, because there was a feedback mechanism. Okay, so it happens both ways. All right. And the left wing is right that yes, CO2 does cause temperature rise, but on those kind of time scales, it just isn't true. It's only in the time scales we're talking about now, it is very true. We're talking about like major fluxes of volcanoes and whatnot, which would be equivalent to what humans are doing. We're basically a human volcano right now. It's like this massive never-ending eruption, okay? Because what do volcanoes do? They pull the carbon from the ground, and they oxidize it, burn it, leave it in the atmosphere. That's what we do. We pull carbon from the ground, we oxidize it, we burn it, and we create energy, and we create CO2. No difference, okay? So we are human volcanoes in a lot of ways. So that's why in the paleoclimate data, we assume that everywhere we see these spikes, these short-term spikes of CO2, that it's probably volcanic related. Probably. Again, do we know? No, we don't know. but it's probable. All right. What else could it be? I don't know. Maybe humans were around. I don't know. Who knows? But the point is, for the past, we can pretty much assess things. For the future, it's almost impossible. Okay, almost impossible to really know what's going to happen. That's why on the policy side, it's a different story. And so back to this idea, inconvenient truth. Al Gore comes out in 2006 to kind of illustrate this policy side of things. Also in that movie, he really stressed Katrina, which had just happened. It was fresh in people's minds because that happened in 2005, which really wasn't fair, I thought. I saw it, I thought it was disgusting. Because he was portraying Katrina and everything that happened there as if it was because of us, like our SUVs and whatnot that have done this, when in reality, the Katrina disaster was a disaster of ill-prepared emergency management and ill-prepared structural, engineering. That they knew this was coming, they didn't do anything about it, okay? So that's what caused Katrina. Category 5s hit Louisiana. It happens. It is in an area that gets hit by strong hurricanes once in a while. And this is an interesting fact, okay? And most people don't know this, because when we start talking about ice ages and climate change and whatnot, okay, 20,000 years ago, when there was 2 miles of ice on top of New York City, 2 miles of ice on top of New York City, okay? This is where Long Island was essentially the outer edge of where the ice ended, okay? So New York City under 2 miles of ice. That's ridiculous to even fathom, okay? But that's what it was, according to what we believe anthropologically and everything else. And so at that time, Louisiana was free of ice and everything. The sea level was lower, but that area of the globe was hit by strong hurricanes periodically, even when there was 2 miles of ice in New York. So in other words, even when the climate of the globe was very much cooler, or in a cooler phase, there were still strong hurricanes hitting that area, or potentially hitting that area, okay? So, the fact that, it's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous to even insinuate that Katrina, or that, any one hurricane is some result of human impacts, okay? It's ridiculous. Well, one caveat to that, though, in 2005, 3 of the top 5 strongest, in terms of millibars, in terms of pressure readings, strongest hurricanes ever formed in the Atlantic Basin, 3 of the 5 ever, happened within 6 weeks of each other in 2005. Katrina was one of them, okay? That part is unusual. But is that from CO2? Or could that be from, again, all the rest of the planets in the solar system are going through changes? Maybe it was something to do with that. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's something like, I don't know if anyone's heard of HAARP. H-A-A-R-P. H-A-A-R-P. HAARP. Look it up yourself. I'm not going to get into the details, okay? But there are some people that, conspiracy theorists that think that the government is controlling the weather. And this is their program to do that kind of thing, okay? It's like emitting frequencies and whatnot, and I'm not going to get into it. But maybe that's part of it, okay? And if there is a top that's controlling the sides against the middle, maybe maybe this is part of that, okay? Let's convince them that they are at fault and let them point fingers at each other while they figure it out, And that's what I feel like this whole thing with this whole climate change debate has been. Is it's based on sound science. Humans are the biggest influence on carbon fluxes right now. Carbon is the biggest greenhouse gas, next to water vapor, that is being emitted right now. Greenhouse gases are the biggest influence in terms of climate forcing factors. Okay, we have the Milankovitch cycles, we have sunspot cycles, we have all this. But as far as those forcing factors go, greenhouse gases are one of the strongest. Sunspot cycles can be right up there with it on these timescales of years to decades. Okay, so that's all true. That's all true. But the leap to say that now we're going to, first of all, use the climate models, which are, speculative at best, and fearmonger and say we only have this much time left. This is what the models tell us. This is what the models, it's science. And then they go back to it's sound science, and they're right. It's based on sound science when you use science for what it's used for, which is assessing the past. But when you start using science to assess the future, well, you start barking up the wrong tree. You really got to bring in other things into account. And so this is where, again, the right wing comes in. We have a sense of stalling the policy, of stalling the policies of capping carbon emissions and trading carbon, which would be essentially limiting us, because carbon is our way of being right now. And so this is a threat to our freedom. It's not an illegitimate threat to our freedom. It is a real threat to our freedom, and I truly believe that. And this is what takes us to what is being done in terms of the empowerment versus disempowerment. And this is how I see it. I see it as the powerful, that are in control, playing both sides against the middle, and we are being disempowered, literally through the energy market. We're being disempowered because we're being made to believe that we have to get energy from out there, that we have to earn it, that it's not just here. The reality, forget alternative energies like wind and solar. Again, these were stalled for a reason. They're starting to get implemented only because they now fit into the monetary system. Because they were almost toward free energy, almost toward accessing accessible energy. That how do you tax this? How do you charge for this? Okay, and this is what the whole idea of off the grid living is, not being charged for your energy. But energy is all around. Energy is here. We are energy. Nothing isn't energy. These are like mind-blowing facts, but they're true. We are energy. Okay, and energy is all around. We have free access to it. Okay, we have a sovereign right to energy, the way I see it, and and that's my whole work with Sovereign Harmony is around this idea that we are all sovereign beings. We have sovereign rights to our energy, to freedom, etc. And that when we claim everything that we are and everything that we deserve, that's when we can live in harmony, because we're not going to project anymore. And what I see is keeping technologies back. There are technologies out there now, and have been for decades, going back to like Nikola Tesla, okay, where we could tap into free energy and really make it so that, when it comes to powering our homes, powering our vehicles to get around, freedom, in other words, powering anything can be done for free. And that is the scariest thing for what is in charge here. What this power, this cap that elephant in the room that really has to move out of the way before things can start making sense. And I'm thankful for the right wing for being so instinctive in backlashing against the policies, because I look at the macrocosm-microcosm relationship, okay, and I'm leaning right and leaning left as I talk to get into the sense of like I'm representing the macrocosm here. That I am both the left and the right wing, just like you are. We all are, okay? We all desire protection for ourselves and the place we live, and we all desire our freedom to enjoy that place that we live, okay? We all do. None of us disagree with that. It's just that we tend, based on our childhood, unresolved childhood wounds in some cases, we might tend to go extreme on one or the other, and to neglect one side for the other. That's all. And what this playing both sides against the middle does is it amplifies that extremism. It amplifies those ingrained, unconscious, unprocessed fears that we have. Fears of not being protected enough, and fears of being too crowded and not free enough to explore and create and have fun. These fears that we developed as infants, essentially, because we had to, because there's no way around that, because we had to rely on someone else to take care of us, etc. But anyway, this takes advantage of that, the deep ingrained psychic aspect of that. And like Bruce Lipton's research even shows that DNA is more of a program than it is an actual a blueprint. It's not a blueprint; it's a program, and it gets turned on and off depending on what's perceived from the environment. Okay, and so if the environment is perceived as safe, then there's going to be issues. You might be more likely to have issues with your freedom getting taken away. If your perception of the environment is that it's not safe, then you might have more issue with your protection getting taken away. Okay, and so this has always been the left-wing, right-wing, battle. Is blaming each other for the parts of themselves they're not accepting, and that's what wholeness is. That's what sovereignty is accepting our wholeness, accepting that we are left and right wing. We are both. Okay, we all want freedom. We all want we all want to be free to enjoy ourselves in a well-protected way. That's what we want. We all want that. It's interesting because extreme right-wing side of it, like the answer is like I'm gonna live on my own, get my gun to protect myself. Again, it's like denying I need protection and then overly protecting yourself. You see, and we kind of see these kind of things how they work. But we have an opportunity to meet in the middle, and I feel like if whoever's in charge, whatever this money system needs to collapse on some level. It needs to release and free us so that we can see clearly for the first time that we're on the same side. That we are all willing to use different fuels and different energies. Just give it to us, I mean, please, because we're ready now. We're all ready now. We're ready to be free, and we're ready to be sovereign and whole, and to get along, and to not have to blame each other for, one side blaming the other side for killing the planet, and the other side blaming them for, killing life, essentially killing the ability to enjoy life, when they're just killing each other. And this is getting worse and worse as time goes on with this two-party system. So, anyway, I don't even know. I just got off on a tangent here, so I don't even know if I've covered everything, if you've heard enough. I don't know. But the point is that there's two sides to every story. With this, there's manipulation going on. There's manipulation and confusion on both sides. Okay, you can say that. And it's not in our best interest, in my opinion, to have any kind of carbon taxes on us, to have any kind of thing limiting what we can do with ourselves, assuming that that's the only way we can do it. We have to understand what's going on with who has the money, who is funding this kind of stuff, and really understand that this technology to free us does exist, and it is this that will allow us to be in our wholeness and our freedom, and to accept each other, and to, at least on this issue, put it to bed, because it would eliminate carbon from humans immediately. And now any problems with global change have nothing to do with humans. So there you go. It's a pretty easy fix. Logistically, you might say, oh yeah, but we have to cut this out and those people have to agree to this. And well, yeah, but it is that simple. It really is that simple. Is that if we have access to free energy, which does exist, and the technology to access it does exist, if we just are allowed to use that, and there goes carbon, there goes human impacts on climate change, there goes any reason to ever tax carbon or to trade carbon at any level, and there goes an amplification of our freedom. So we get more freedom, more protection for the environment because there's less pollution, there's less CO2, etc. Win-win and into wholeness. Okay, I'll leave you with that. If there's any, I might have left something out, but I have no idea where I go with these things when I sit down. I just kind of float with it. So anyway, thanks for joining me. That's my take on it. And so I'm Christopher Taylor signing out. Sovereign Harmony. Take care.